She had 5 pages of notes, guys, 5 pages of documentation, multiple witnesses backing her up, and a clear pattern of mistreatment. And somehow HR still told her, sorry, we can't help you. That's exactly what happened in the case we're talking about today. And this is where a lot of employees get frustrated because let's be honest, if you're being treated unfairly, sometimes you don't care about whether or not it's illegal. But there's a big difference between something being unfair and something being illegal. So we're going to take a look at what went wrong in this case. And I want to share with you something you can do if this happens to you. Hi, I'm Harlow Reed, employment lawyer, HR consultant, and creator of the HR Insider. On this channel, I do more than share my legal opinion. I break down real legal cases to show how the law might apply to your situation. And today's case involves Susan Baldwin, an employee who took her complaints about workplace harassment to HR only to find herself out of a job. She sued her employer, but what happened in court might surprise you. Let's talk about it. The content shared on this channel is for informational purposes only and shouldn't be taken as legal advice. Always consult a qualified attorney or HR professional for guidance on your specific situation. And hey, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, let's break this one down. Susan Baldwin was an employee at Blue Cross, and she had a problem with her manager, Scott Head. And let me tell you, this guy was more than unprofessional. Susan started working at Blue Cross back in 1989, and over the years, she worked her way up to a marketing representative role. So that's what she was doing by 1998, working in the Huntsville, Alabama office. And it was in November of 2000 when Scott Head was promoted from marketing representative to a district manager in Huntsville, which made him Susan's boss. So there were a lot of twists and turns in this case, but as I read through the evidence, there was some indication that the relationship between Scott and Susan wasn't exactly smooth sailing, and there had been some tension between them for a while. Susan testified that she remembered that Scott made it clear what he thought about women in the workplace because he referenced her as being a token hire. He said the only reason she was there was because they needed a skirt. And Susan was offended that he called women in the office babe all the time, but she never filed a formal complaint about it. And she believed that he also had some unethical practices. She said that she knew that at times he had mistreated customers. And so those were some of the things that rubbed her the wrong way about him. So she ended up backing someone else for the district manager job that he was eventually given. And of course, Scott was aware of that. So it's safe to say that they were never each other's biggest fans. But when Scott Head's promotion to district manager was announced in November of 2000, Susan Baldwin took the high road and she stopped by his office to congratulate him. Instead of just accepting the gesture, Scott asked her to come in and sit down. And he said, "Hey, babe, are you on my team?" Susan kept it professional, telling him that everyone in the Huntsville office was on his team and that she would continue to do her job as she always had. But that wasn't the answer that Scott was looking for. And he said, "That's not the question I asked you." When Susan stood her ground and said she believed she had answered him, things escalated, and Scott stood up, leaned across his desk in what Susan described as a very raised tone, and said, "That's not the effing question I asked you. Are you on my team?" And what followed was a long, heated back and forth. So, for the next 8 months, things were relatively smooth between Scott and Susan. If Susan had a question for Scott or if he needed something from her, she felt everything was handled professionally. Scott did use some bad language, but it wasn't directed at her in a threatening way. And she later explained in her deposition that she felt profanity could be used in different ways. And she acknowledged that there's a difference between someone swearing around you and someone actually swearing at you. And when asked directly, she said that she couldn't recall a single instance since Scott's promotion where he had cursed at her in a way that felt threatening. She also admitted that she had used profanity in the office herself, but not regularly. But eventually, Scott did begin using profanity on a daily basis, and that's probably putting it mildly. He called the marketing representatives, who were all men except for Susan, cocksuckers and peckerwoods. For example, he would gather them for meetings by saying, "Hey, you bunch of cocksuckers. Hey, you bunch of peckerwoods, come in here. I need to talk to y'all." During meetings, he'd casually throw in lines like, "Hey, you bunch of cocksuckers, how much business I got coming in." And he often said the word FUCK liberally in everyday conversation, whether it was "what the FUCK" or something along those lines. As for how he spoke about women, and Susan testified that he used the word BITCH to refer to women in general. On July 26, 2001, Scott Head, Susan Baldwin, and other marketing reps from Huntsville attended a banquet in Birmingham, Alabama, honoring top Blue Cross managers. Later during the banquet, Scott Head suggested Susan Baldwin stay in Birmingham for a night of dancing and offered his hotel room, saying, "No one will ever know." Baldwin declined, saying that she had meetings the next day, and drove back to Huntsville. On the drive home, Scott had called Susan Baldwin, urging her to hang out with him. He said, "I'll stop by, bring beer," and he wanted to take her for a drive through Green Mountain. And Susan declined. He kept calling, and as she arrived home, he claimed that he was at her front door. She wasn't sure if he was really there, but she said, "Scott, you just need to go home to your wife and kids." And he said, "All right, babe." A few days later, Scott Head called Susan into his office, and when she stepped in, he shut the door, walked behind her, and said, "Hey, babe, blow me," moving so close that only thing she could do was to just fall backward onto the couch in his office. Susan realized that something was off with Scott and she had work to do, so she just left his office. But by then, she said she was genuinely afraid of him because of what he had said to her, and things only got worse. Scott's cursing became routine. When he was discussing a promotion, he said, "I need to hire a guy for this job, Susan, someone with balls like you." He called women who didn't get a job on his team sluts and tramps, and she also overheard him joking with other male colleagues about their wives, making comments like, "Yeah, your wife looks good this morning. I'm headed over to your house this afternoon to see your wife." Things that Susan felt were just inappropriately appropriate and made her feel uncomfortable. And so Susan went to Blue Cross's HR department and met with Emma Barclay. And this wasn't a quick conversation. Susan came prepared. She had over 5 pages of summary notes detailing all of the offensive behaviors that she experienced since Scott received his promotion. Human Resources conducted an investigation, but none of the witnesses provided by Susan were able to corroborate her story, and Scott also denied the allegations that she made. He did acknowledge that he called a male employee Peckerwood, but otherwise there was no corroboration of Susan's claims. And so Human Resources decided that the best approach would be to have mediation between Scott and Susan, but the harassment camp claims, because they were unsubstantiated, Scott received a warning that any future violations could lead to his termination, and the investigation was closed. After the investigation was over, Susan refused to work with Scott Head. She declined counseling and turned down an offer to transfer to another office. And so, since she rejected what Blue Cross considered reasonable solutions to the concerns that she brought to their attention, the company decided to let her go. I didn't cover all of the examples that Susan gave Human Resources. There are many more, but I'm trying to keep this video short. I think it's fair to say that Susan had every right to feel hurt and frustrated and disheartened by what she went through, because she put up with some really unprofessional and inappropriate behavior from her supervisor for a long time. And by the time she finally reported it, she had clearly hit her
Here's the
breaking point.
thing, but
When emotions run high, it can sometimes lead to reacting in ways that may not be the most helpful to the person who's making that complaint, who the person to the person who is being wronged. And that's one of the things that abusers will do. Abusers will get you in an emotional state so that you don't respond well, so that you don't react well. And I imagine that Susan, as a young woman who hadn't experienced someone who can work in an environment to frustrate people and to agitate people, was reacting how most people would if they'd never experienced an individual like that before. This all led to her frustration to reject the compromises that were offered to her by Blue Cross. And Blue Cross saw that as unreasonable. Now, this ties into something I've actually covered in another video, Workplace Investigations Gone Wrong. In that video, I break down the signs to recognize when an investigation is being handled the wrong way. And it is important to understand that, because knowing what to do when things are not handled properly can make all the difference in how you move forward. So check it out. And after she was terminated, Susan was just angry enough to carry this all the way through to the courtroom. She filed a suit on September 24th against Blue Cross Blue Shield of Alabama. And although it was filed in September of 2003, the case wasn't decided by the United States Court of Appeals until March 19th, 2007. Guys, that's a full 3 years after it was filed. I say all the time, filing a lawsuit is a long game. You are not going to get a resolution quick. The court does not work that way. This is just another example of that. When it came to her hostile work environment claim, the district court ruled that even if everything she said was true, harassment wasn't considered severe or pervasive enough to legally qualify as harassment. And this is the thing. Sometimes you have a bad boss. Sometimes you have someone that is agitating and aggravating you. And it's important to know how to manage that person, how to manage your circumstances, because if it's not pervasive and it's not rising to the level of the legal definition of harassment, you're not going to get a claim that is in your favor. And even if it had been rose to the level of harassment, Blue Cross had an affirmative defense in place because they had policies to address harassment and they took steps to handle her complaint. So in this case, HR really did the right thing. And sometimes when you file a complaint, the investigation is not going to be the outcome that you want. Oftentimes, it's based on the information that's in front of the HR person who's doing the investigation. It's important to remember, even the person who is being accused of harassment has rights. And some of these people are not so arrogant to think they can get away with it. So they're very sneaky, they're very cowardly, and they're very cunning. And if you've never encountered a person like that, you're not going to know how to deal with it. You think you take it to HR and it's resolved. This isn't the first time that they've been reported to HR. They know how to handle something like this, and they know how to fly right below the radar so that they don't get caught up. As for her retaliation claim, the court sided with Blue Cross as well. They said that they gave what was a legitimate, non retaliatory reason for firing Susan, and she wasn't able to provide enough evidence to prove that the fact that she was terminated was a cover for retaliation. The court dismissed all of Susan's claims and sided completely with Blue Cross. If you find yourself in a similar situation, one of the things to ask is whether or not the claim you have submitted to HR is based in a protected category. A protected category are things like race, gender, disability, religion, those types of things that are covered under the law place an obligation on your employer to, number one, take your complaint seriously, and number two, look for ways to resolve it so that it doesn't support a claim of discrimination. And I would say if you have not based your claim in one of those protected categories, it's less likely that you're going to receive the outcome that you're looking for. And I wouldn't try to pursue it if there's not enough to legitimize that you have some protections under the law. The next thing you can do if the outcome is not what you expected is to ask for a written explanation. This goes without saying and should be standard operating procedure for an investigation. But if for some reason you did not receive a letter of conclusion that clearly outlines the findings and what the next steps are in terms of those findings, then you should ask for it because you want to know exactly why they're not taking the action that you expected they would, and that keeps them accountable and gives you a paper trail to help you decide what your next step should be. And finally, you may need to start planning your exit strategy. And I know that's not fair, and I know it's easier said than done, but sometimes leaving is the best option. I think about Susan in this case, Susan Baldwin, who had to endure all of the abuse and all of the bad language and inappropriate conduct that had a lasting effect on her, undoubtedly had a lasting effect on her next career move, but also on her mental well being, her emotional state. Having to be in an environment like that every day can be quite impactful on you, on your mental health. So sometimes it is better to start planning an exit strategy and looking for what your next opportunity will be. And that doesn't mean that you can't pursue it legally. You can always talk to an employment attorney or consult with the EEOC and make them aware of what your concerns are. But your first point of focus should be, how do I protect myself and make sure that I'm okay mentally, physically, and not subjecting myself to such a toxic workplace on a daily basis. So now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever reported something to HR and felt like nothing was done? Share your experience in the comments below. I'd love to hear what happened. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks so much for watching today. I'll see you in the next video.